About 4 years ago, myself and 3 Haunted Earth investigators joined a ticketed paranormal investigation at the Youth Hostel Association in Saffron, Walden, Essex. The hostel is situated inside a large and rambling timber frame building which dates from 1450, and throughout its long history it has served many purposes, including that as a schoolhouse and, more sinister perhaps, as a prison. Its most notable association is with the English Civil War, when troops from Sir Thomas Fairfax's army were billeted there, and when their royalist prisoners were held in captivity within its cavernous cellar. Today, the old world charm of this wonderful building is now appreciated by weary travellers and groups who use the building as a launchpad to cycle or ramble around this most beautiful of all Essex towns. On arrival, we joined up with another group who had hired the premises for the investigation. I was escorted by their group leader to explore the building prior to the start, and in that brief period the entire history seemed to willingly yield itself to me, and many presences were detected and relayed to my guide. My psychic ability is very strongly empathic, that is to say, I can sense people's emotional states, whether alive or in spirit, and occasionally I can allow myself to take on the personality and the character of those spiritual energies. This particular night proved to be one of my most strongest challenges, as I encountered some interesting as well as frightening characters who still walk its uneven oak floorboards. We then returned for the pre-investigative briefing and were allowed to investigate the building as our own group, providing we kept to one section of the building at a time. My first encounter occurred in the briefing area, which from memory was a large entrance hall. I picked up upon a butler or manservant dressed in Regency period clothing, who imperiously entered the hall and walked past us into a neighbouring room carrying a silver salver. He was a strange creature to behold, being very thin with a sharp skeletal face. His hair was thin and grey and without the adornment of a wig, and he wore a high-button frock coat with breeches which appeared dark purple in colour. I would say he was aged around 50 to 60, and his skin was pale and thin to the bone, like the colour of parchment paper. He was aware of our presence, but he chose to ignore us while he still performed duties from over 200 years ago. From that moment onwards I met this character 3 or 4 times during the all-night vigil, and from my initial encounter he seemed uninterested and quite disconnected. A colleague took a picture at my request and captured this orb to the right of me, where I first felt this servant to be on one occasion. On a further encounter with him, another picture captured again an orb where I felt him to be, and this, as can be seen, is to the left of the fireplace. We had access throughout the entire building and grounds, and my most memorable encounters were these. In the grounds I met the presence of an officer dressed in Civil War battle dress. He wore a heavy light brown coat, over which he wore on his chest a silver breastplate. His headdress was a typical model army lobster pot helmet, and he proudly wore a diagonally placed leather sword belt strap across his chest, and over which he wore a red sash, which again ran diagonally across his chest. His right hand firmly clenched the sword hilt in its scabbard, and he strode across the grounds like an officer in charge, and importantly in firm control. I then decided to allow myself to be overshadowed by him, and I felt what can be best described as a partial possession. He was, I gleaned, a bluff Yorkshireman who tired of being there, and his thoughts were preoccupied by growing discontent amongst his troops, who had not been paid and, like he, wanted to return home. Another worrying factor was his deep-rooted and almost psychotic hatred of the royalist prisoners who still remained in his charge. I then saw the grounds as being much different to that of today. I recall a line of stables and a large open fire with troops huddled around as if to keep warm. He was, I felt, a man to be of many contrasts. Whilst being deeply religious, he bore or sought no quarter of tolerance with the royalist traitors, and had sent many an innocent man to an early grave. I felt uncomfortable with him, and pulled myself away whilst he slowly disappeared from memory. A photo was taken at this point of departure, and shows an orb in the far distance. Having regained myself, we stopped briefly in the dining area for a short break, whilst we decided to investigate an old cart lodge which was next to the main building and bore an upper hayloft above. This was a strange experience. We all felt the presence of a man who suffered with a very low IQ, and throughout his short and miserable life he was treated as no better than an animal, and was reduced to living like one with the hayloft as his only mortal home. He was reserved and shy, and a strong fear of us permeated throughout this old wooden structure, which by now was used as a storage area. His sadness really affected me, and almost reduced myself to tears when I attempted to connect with him. But he was not having that, and so I and the others reluctantly left him alone to live an eternity trapped by his own fear and suspicion of the living. Not all of the encounters was unpleasant by any means. In one small anteroom upstairs in the main building, I encountered the spirit of a lively and friendly Flemish girl, whose family had fled the Low Countries through religious persecution. I saw her aged around 16 years. She was sewing when we encountered her, and introduced herself as Mariette de Kuiper. She stated that she lived a long and happy life here, and was in service to the family that then owned the building. The strangest experience of the night then occurred in her company, when we all unexpectedly started to laugh loudly for no apparent reason. I was forced to remove a shoe as I felt my foot being tickled, and that too was a similar cause for the rest of the group. She smiled at me, and in a Dutch-sounding accent she said, "You like?" We remained with this energy for around 10 minutes longer, when she eventually faded from view. Another room of interest was a dormitory next to the main staircase. In this experience I assumed the persona of a late Victorian or early Edwardian schoolmaster. This energy appeared to want to walk up and down the aisles of beds, watching scrupulously over his young charges. He was aged in his 20s to early 30s, and seemed to be a very strict disciplinarian. A team member took a photograph and captured this orb in motion by my feet, as this character led me along the room. I was minded by this person to walk into the main staircase, where I recall there was a room at the top and aside the dormitory. Here I captured an orb on the staircase with a digital still camera. He then descended the steps to the bottom where his presence now remained, and these two orb pictures were captured. I didn't feel comfortable with his presence and broke away very quickly. However, the weirdest experience of the entire night occurred in the cellars beneath. Another guest was walking along the cellar passageway when a team member shouted "flash" and took a photograph. The strangest thing was that the guest, a young man in his early 20s and very much alive, failed to appear in the photograph. We showed him the picture immediately after it was taken, and he was naturally very shaken. He kept assuring us that he wasn't in spirit despite what the camera had captured. In this footage, the presence of a priest who was betrayed from his hiding place during a turbulent period of religious persecution was seen and indicated by me to the others. A video recording here clearly shows the descent of two orbs at the point I had experienced him. He was apparently in hiding in a priest's hole when his presence was betrayed by a man who owed him money. Sadly, some things in this world never change.